Over the last 3 weeks or so, Eric and I have shared with you what I think are some of the deepest, some of the heaviest teachings that we know. So many of you have been so kind to speak to us about these lessons and the way that they have impacted you, the way that they have touched you. Some of you have kind of invited us into the sacred space of your own personal story, your own personal suffering, and you have allowed us to see in that what God has done and how it's changed you and how it's impacted you. But I also know there's some of you who have not talked to us. There are some of you who are in the midst of suffering that, quite honestly, we acknowledge may be indescribable. And you may have listened over the last couple of weeks as Eric and I have shared our own scars, our own wounds, our own stories, and you may have thought to yourself, you too don't know the first thing about real suffering. And you're probably right. But may I say to you that as we've walked through this study, it has never been our intention, not in any way, to minimize your pain, to trivialize where you're sitting at right now, or to make it sound like we're some kind of authority on what suffering should look like and feel like and how to get over it. In fact, I don't really think you do get over the pain that life brings us. Some of you suffering right now can attest to the fact that you may adjust to a new normal. You may learn to do some things differently. You may experience life as it moves forward, but never, ever do you get over the pain that you've experienced. And we don't want to suggest that that's true. I'll even go so far as to say, if you know that your pain is temporary, if you know that what you're experiencing is something that's going to end, and maybe you can even kind of see through to the other side of it, and you know that the other side is going to be okay, it's going to be better. Still, that doesn't minimize the pain that you experience. And I think Jesus demonstrates this perfectly from his own life in John chapter 11. You know the story. It's one we're familiar with, maybe sometimes a little too familiar with some of these stories, but the gist of what's happening in John 11 is Lazarus was sick, and Jesus got word, and he delayed on purpose until Lazarus died and was buried. And then he shows up in Bethany, and he meets Mary and Martha, very close friends of his, as was Lazarus, the sisters of the dead man. And they are hurting, and they are suffering, and they are struggling, and as far as they're concerned, Jesus is too late. In fact, I think they would even say, this is your fault. If you'd have been here, if you'd have showed up when we needed you to show up, this wouldn't have happened. Now, Jesus knew. Jesus knew how the story was going to turn out. Jesus knew that this story was going to end in resurrection. But do you know what Jesus did? Jesus stood, and he felt the pain of Mary, and he felt the pain of Martha, and I think he even felt his own grief. And Jesus cried. He cried. And in that moment, I think Jesus is as human as he's ever been for me. In that moment, I think I find a Jesus who I can so easily identify with, because I have felt pain, and I have cried. And just like Lazarus' story ends with resurrection, I know, somewhere inside me, I know that my story, that your story as followers of Jesus, our stories will end in resurrection too. But can it be hard to see that through the fog of pain? Isn't it true that sometimes we want to know that something better is coming, but our suffering won't let us take hold of that? We've talked a lot about the lament psalms, And one of those Psalms in particular, I think, is very poignant because it reminds us that suffering in this present life doesn't always come with a fairy tale happy ending. It doesn't always work out the way I want it to or I hope it does. Psalm 88, unlike the other lament psalms, which all end with this statement of trust in God, Psalm 88 ends with these words: darkness is my only friend. Darkness is my only friend. Maybe what we need to be reminded of today is that suffering is not wasted. That suffering is not worthless with God. Even if to us in the moment it looks pointless, even if we can't possibly see any good that can come from it, we have to rely on the fact that God says it's worth something. Paul over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, describes the pain and the affliction of this life with adjectives like light and momentary. And while those words might not be the words we want to hear, he says what's happening when you suffer, when you experience affliction, when you go through pain, it is producing a glory that far outweighs all the bad stuff you've endured. So that can give us hope, right? Hope that our suffering maybe is temporary. Hope that God is going to show up and do something. Hope that it's not worthless. But that can be really, really hard when all I feel is pain.
We've used several word combinations during this series that don't seem to fit. In fact, they seem to contradict one another. Josh Ross wrote a book some years ago called Scarred Faith. And I know you're getting tired of me recommending books. Give me one more. Josh wrote this book following the death of his sister Jenny. And I was working with Josh's brother Jonathan in Houston at the time. And I remember being at the hospital with the family, and I remember that the Ross family did not do this for a show. Let me say that first. That's who they are. That's what their faith is about. But the faith that they modeled during this period of time was just, it was amazing. And it was good for others to see. It was something that I marveled at. It's a place that I want to get to. It's a place that we all want to get to. Josh uses this term in his book. He talks about suffering well. And those are two words that do not go together. Just adding to the list of word combinations we've used that do not go together in this series. But when he talks about suffering well, and for me, having experienced being at the hospital with them and being in community with them during this time where Jenny was sick and ultimately passed away, when Josh writes and he talks about suffering well, he's doing it from a place that I've seen, a place of experience. And I think one of the things that he's discussing, and probably the point that he's trying to get to, is that suffering is unavoidable in this life. All of our lives are going to be touched by suffering. We're all going to experience pain. We're all going to experience loss. And what we have to do in order to be able to maintain our faith through the process of suffering is we have to be prepared to suffer well. How do you prepare? How do you prepare to suffer? In order to suffer well, one of the things we have to do, maybe the first thing we have to do, is we have to give up what I'm calling the illusion of control. Now, I will say I probably didn't coin that phrase. So you can use it without giving me credit. But we have this illusion of control that we live with as human beings. And the reality of it is, Paul talks about this illusion of control and where we have to get in order to suffer well, and kind of what that looks like and how we bring that about in our lives. But before we get to what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 1, let me say one thing. I'm pretty big on things, and you probably know this already. I'm pretty big on things we should stop saying, that we've probably said for years and years and years, that we think are helpful, that are really not. I'm going to do one more, if you'll indulge me. Sometimes when people are suffering, we will say something to the effect of, God will not allow you to suffer beyond what you're able to endure. We need to stop saying that. And I say that because that's not biblical. That's inaccurate. And I think I know how we've landed on that. I think that's something that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. We don't have time to go deep into that today, but I would recommend reading that again in context. Because Paul's talking about temptation, not suffering. Okay, I got to move on. But I would recommend reading that, because that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that God will not allow you to suffer beyond what you're able to endure. In fact, if we read his second letter to the Corinthians, he's telling them, I want to tell you what happened in the province of Asia. I want to tell you about what happened, because what we experienced is we were crushed, he says. We were overwhelmed. Listen to this. We were overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure. We thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But here's what happened as a result. As a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God. I like that he said, not just we learn to rely on God, we learn to only rely on God. And I think that's where this illusion of control comes into play, because we're okay with giving God some things. We're okay with allowing God to control some things, because we think to ourselves that we still have control over some things. The fact of the matter is, God is the only one who has control over anything. And I remember sitting with Scott Owens a few years ago at coffee, and we were talking about this idea, this illusion of control, or what we call the delusion of control. You see what I did there? Because we are delusional if we think we control anything. And that's one of the things that Scott said that is imprinted on my brain, is he said, the fact of the matter is, we don't control anything. And I thought about that. And I went back and I look at what James says in James chapter 4, when he says, we always talk about we're going to go today or tomorrow, we're going to go here or there and do this or that. And the reality of it is, we don't even know if there's going to be a tomorrow. And the larger fact of that is that we have no control of whether there will be or there won't be. The fact of the matter is, we have only to rely completely on God, because we have no control over anything. Everything that we know to be true, that we think we control in our lives, could change in a split second, and everything be different tomorrow, and we have no control over that whatsoever. So in order to defeat this delusion of control, we must do exactly what Paul said. And the first step we have to take in suffering well is we have to not give God control. We talk about, I'm going to give God control. We don't give God control. We didn't have it to begin with, so we can't give it to him. We have to understand that we can only rely on God because he is the only one who is in control. We have to relinquish that delusion and admit and accept and embrace total and 100% reliance upon God.
In other words, it's coming. Pain and suffering are coming, and there's really nothing, despite what the prosperity gospel folks would say to us, there is nothing that we can do, even with the aid of God, to prevent pain and suffering entering our experience. We'd like to think we could, but we can't. It is the reality of life. We're going to hurt. We're going to suffer. There are going to be painful things. But we then try to accept that truth. And we try to practice this idea of not believing that we're in control. And we try to tell ourselves, okay, there's something bad probably that I'm going to experience. And we think we're prepared. We think we're ready. And then something shows up at our doorstep that is far worse than anything we could have ever dreamed up. And we have no idea what to do. We are stunned. We are crippled. Earlier in this series, we talked about learning to use lament or learning to use language to express to God what we're really feeling and to ask the hard questions when the hard things are happening, not the least of which is the question, why? Now, we've come up with several responses to that, and some of you have shared some of that with me, but I think as we walk through pain and suffering with God, as we learn to lean into Him, as we learn to trust in His control, maybe that can produce in us a little bit of a shift in our perspective. So that instead of being so quick to ask the question, why, maybe our question will become, what can God do with this? What can God and I do with this pain? Eric already mentioned 2 Corinthians chapter 1 where Paul talks about what we can learn from the things that we suffer. But I want to go back to that chapter and go back more toward the beginning of it. And I want you to listen to Paul's words there, because I think what he's reminding us is that there are ways that God can not just step into our pain with us, but do something with it. This begins in verse 3 of 2 Corinthians 1. All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Listen to this. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. God comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort that God has given us. For the more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with His comfort through Christ. Even when we are weighed down with troubles, it is for your comfort and salvation. For when we ourselves are comforted, we will certainly comfort you. Then you can patiently endure the same things we suffer. We are confident that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in the comfort God gives us. Now, you might have gotten a little tangled up in there because the word comfort showed up a lot, and you and us. Eugene Peterson boils it down this way. God comes alongside us when we go through hard times, and before you know it, He brings us alongside someone else who is also going through hard times, so that we can be there for that person just like God was there for us. God helps us when we are in pain so that we then become conduits of His comfort. I have watched so many of you in this room do this very thing. A lot of you here have suffered through some pretty specific things, and I've watched you reach out from that place of suffering to someone else who is suffering some similar experience. And your pain plus God's comfort lets you do something that no one else might be able to do. Because I believe your pain can prepare you to come alongside somebody. God can be using these terrible experiences to get you ready to walk with someone else who is hurting. I wish we had time this morning to explore the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva. The short version is that it is as simple as when someone experiences a death loss, other people just show up and sit. That's it. They just show up. They're just there with grieving people. And I think Thinking back to the story of Job, it's one we've used a lot in this series. I think that's the one thing Job's friends did exactly right. They knew he was hurting. And they showed up, and I don't know what their life had been like. I don't know what their pain experience had been like, but they showed up, and they sat in silence. You see, this may be the way that God chooses to use your pain. He may be working through that to prepare you to be there for some fellow struggler.
Because suffering well means never suffering alone. I talk about sometimes things that we should stop saying. And I think that we've said those things for a period of time because we want so desperately to help. We want so desperately to end one another's pain. I want to take away your pain. But the fact of the matter is, I don't have that ability. So what do? What we do is, like Tim said, we suffer as a community. Paul leans into this in Romans chapter 12 when he tells us to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. That is life in the body of Christ. When you have something to celebrate, we all celebrate with you. And when you hurt, we hurt with you. That's being a member of the body of Christ. That is being a member of the family of God. And suffering gives us the opportunity, like Adam said beautifully during communion this morning, it gives us the opportunity to be the physical manifestation of the heart of God. Not that we can take anyone's pain away, but suffering connects us in a way that really nothing else does. Again, Josh talks about this in his book, Scarred Faith, and he had this quote, and it fits perfectly. As uncomfortable, unfriendly, and unwarranted as suffering can be, pain connects us with others. It forms alliances and gives us common ground to connect with people we might never otherwise come into contact with. Few people do community better than pain-ridden people. That's how we suffer well. Because although I would love to take away your pain, and in some cases I would do anything to take away your pain, I understand that more now as a parent than ever before. What would I give to take away my children's pain? I can't think of anything I wouldn't give. As the family of God, we suffer like that with each other. I want to take away your pain. And the helplessness of knowing that I cannot leads us sometimes to say things that don't really help. And we say these because I really think we have the greatest intentions behind them. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes suffering well means what Tim was talking about with Job's friends. And I will tell you, nobody gives Job's friends a harder time than I do, okay? Nobody. But the one thing they did right is the one thing that we can do. We don't have to tell people, oh, it's going to be okay one day. We don't have to have all these words of comfort. Sometimes suffering well and what I can do with my pain and how I can share with your experience is just to sit down in the dirt with you. It's hard for me to say suffering is better together. Again, that just doesn't feel right to say that. It feels like that's a contradictory statement. But suffering and the body of Christ, we were designed to suffer together because nothing in all of life was made to be experienced alone.
There is so much more that we could say. We have wrestled through this entire series with what to say and what not to say and what to leave out. And I don't just mean in procedural terms. I mean, it's been so hard to know, but I am so confident in God's ability to take the things that we have said and use them with you as he needs to. It's remarkable how he does that. I want to close this series by reminding you once again of the absolute presence of God in your suffering. I want you to see and to know and to believe with all your heart that God entered into humanity through Jesus, and now he actually knows what it feels like when his creation suffers because he stepped into it with us. But that should not surprise us, because God has always, always, always been the gracious, compassionate, loving God. And he's always had a vested interest in being with his people. And I want you to walk out of this lesson and into Four Corners today with that sense that God is present in your suffering. I brought something with me today, and I know some of you may have a hard time seeing this where you are, and so I'm going to put a picture on the screen to show you this. Oh, we went too far. This was brought to me by a very dear friend from Jerusalem. It is not a miniature vase. It's not a very strange little glass to drink from. The fancy term, if you want the 50-cent name for it, is it's a lacrimatory. But who cares about lacrimatory? What this is a tear catcher. It's a tear catcher. In ancient times and all the way up into the Victorian era in our own country, there was the practice when someone was in intense pain of catching the tears. And some, if you look especially in the Victorian tear catchers, you'll find that most of them have a stopper or a top or a lid of some kind so that you could cry and catch those tears and put the lid on and keep them for some later purpose. But you will notice that mine does not have a top. It is, in fact, open with no sort of stopper in it. And I think that's on purpose, because the design of this tear catcher was to cry, to literally catch your tears in this bottle, and then to pour those tears out as a worship offering before God. You say, well, that's an interesting little visual aid, but I don't really understand why that matters. In Psalm 56, David has been caught by the Philistines. We might give him the modern title of a prisoner of war. And things look pretty bleak, and he opens Psalm 56, as we would expect him to, complaining about what's going on and telling God, this is the problem, God. But then you get down into his recognition of what God has done and been in his life. And in verse 8, he says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You've collected all my tears in your bottle. You've recorded them all in your book. David says, God, it's pretty bad right now, and you know that where I'm at, it's caused me to weep a lot over what's going on. But God, I know that there is not a tear that has fallen from my face that you didn't see. There isn't any grief or pain or hurt that I've experienced that you don't know personally. You caught my tears in your bottle. God is so aware of our suffering. God is so in tune with you, so attentive to your pain, that I believe God is still in the practice of catching your tears. Really? Until, as Jeff read earlier, there are no more. Because that's the business of God. Your pain, your suffering, your experience of grief or loss or something far worse is not worthless. It is not pointless. It may be hard to believe that right now, but God, the loving, gracious, compassionate God, is in that suffering with you, and he stands right now ready to catch your tears in his bottle, because they don't escape his notice. Maybe today our time in Four Corners is the perfect time for you to let those tears go.